How do you come to terms with the fact that you were indoctrinated by well-meaning people? By people who truly loved you and wanted the best for you? Where do you place the blame? Maybe it's no one's fault and you were just dealt the same hand that most people who have ever lived were dealt. You were taught the same things that your community happened to believe. But it is frightening to realize just how little of what people believe has anything to do with the honest pursuit of truth. The vast majority of people on the planet are content to ride the waves of their culture and tradition without even a second thought. Sure, when it comes to religion, everyone has their doubts, but at the end of the day, most people choose to take the easiest path. The path of easier relationships with family members, a moral code that is explicitly spelled out for you, and a community that provides a sense of purpose and meaning beyond yourself. These are real benefits, so it makes sense why people choose this route. They just accept that they will never have complete certainty as to life's biggest questions, and just continue down the path that has already been laid out for them. But what happens when a wrench gets thrown into the system and you realize that you are no longer convinced of the things you once were? What happens when you just stop believing? When everything you were taught starts falling apart in your mind? When you find yourself floating in an ocean of uncertainty with nothing to hold on to? Well, you either learn to float or you drown in confusion and despair. You have to accept your existential circumstance and realize that the thing you were holding on to never existed in the first place, and you are actually now in a better position to create something new, something real. In this video, I want to explain why I stopped believing in Christianity. The purpose is not to be a comprehensive argument against the faith, and it certainly won't contain all of my thoughts on the subject. This is honestly just more of a personal journal entry and an attempt to organize my thoughts. But I hope that it might help other people navigate their own thoughts and at the very least make someone feel like they aren't alone. I was raised in a Christian home and went to non-denominational churches for my entire life. I feel grateful to say that I've only ever had positive experiences within the church. I know that many people cannot say the same. My faith ebbed and flowed throughout my childhood, but I left college in 2021 still a believing Christian who was committed to living the Christian life. It wasn't until the past year when I began to consider the intellectual challenges to my faith from new perspectives. In the past, when I had questions, I would just seek out the answers given by professional apologists, and I took their word as gospel without thinking much about the content of their responses and whether or not they actually made much sense. As long as they confirmed my beliefs, I would just move on. A great example of this is on the issue of hell. I remember being around 18 years old and wondering why God would send people to hell for essentially just not being convinced that something was true. I then sought out answers, and unsurprisingly, I looked to people who were Christians like me. These were apologists who said things like, God doesn't send people to hell, people choose to go to hell. And when I heard this, I thought, yep, that makes sense. Question answered. And I didn't reconsider that answer for another 8 years. Now I know how silly that answer is. No one would choose to go to hell because it is a place filled with suffering. No one chooses eternal suffering. Not even the most God-hating, evil person you can imagine. Sheer self-interest will prevent this. Christians have this idea that all non-believers are walking around harboring some kind of hatred in their hearts towards Yahweh that makes them reject His grace to the point of actually choosing eternal suffering. But how many people living on earth right now does that actually describe? How many of them are actually consciously choosing hell instead of God? Think about a random Japanese grandmother who lives in Tokyo and is not a Christian. Is she really just so mad at the Christian God that she is consciously choosing to go to hell? That's absurd. Not to mention, this would require her to believe that He actually exists. You can't reject someone you don't believe is real, and you can't choose to go to a place that you don't believe exists. The reality is that she is just a product of her environment like everyone else. She probably has heard about Jesus, and she thinks it's some strange Western superstition. Maybe she has actually said in her mind, I don't believe that Christianity is true. Does this mean that she has chosen to experience eternal suffering? No, of course not. If Christianity is true, the only thing she is guilty of is a lack of information. I know how many interpretations of hell there are among Christians, and I've heard them all. But none of these explanations, from annihilationism to universal reconciliation, make any sense upon closer inspection. I found time and time again that for many of my questions about my faith, every time I would add in a new piece of the puzzle to make it all fit together, another one would fall out. Here's a quick example. Some Christians argue that anyone can come to know God just by looking at the trees. This comes from Romans 1:20, which says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made so that people are without excuse." So basically, creation leaves people without an excuse for not accepting God. That makes sense, the puzzle piece fits. But what if you choose the wrong God? Muslims believe that creation is evidence for God just like Christians do, but they think another God did it. Are they really without excuse? And another puzzle piece falls out. But all of this became moot once I saw that hell was an idea that evolved throughout history. And this is evident in the different conceptions of the afterlife within the Bible itself, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. I began to see the Bible in an entirely new way. I realized that the Bible is better explained as a human document written in specific periods of history and evolving over time than as the word of an all-powerful, all-knowing, unchanging God. That is the most likely explanation. Apologists always try to convince people of what is possible, but I realized that there is a big difference between what is possible and what is probable. And during my investigations and discoveries, the most probable answer never came down on the side of the Bible having been written by God. And this brings me to history. When you truly understand the origins of the Bible, you can't help but see human fingerprints all over it. One thing to recognize is that there are many cultures that influence the beliefs of the Jewish people. A good example is the Persians. The Jews were under Persian rule from 539 to 332 BCE. The dominant Persian religion at the time was Zoroastrianism. This religion contained beliefs like a cosmic struggle between good and evil, more specifically a good god called Ahura Mazda and an evil god called Ahriman. This is how the Jews developed the idea of Satan being an actual cosmic opponent to God who wants evil and destruction. Originally, in the Old Testament, Satan, which literally means adversary, was a member of God's council in heaven, and his job was to play devil's advocate. Remember in the story of Job where Satan just appears in heaven out of nowhere to challenge God? Well, that's the Old Testament Satan, just another angel whose purpose was to argue against God. I actually remember being in elementary school and having a teacher explain Satan's random appearance in the story of Job by saying that God just decided to let Satan back into heaven for a while because he does that from time to time when he wants to talk to him. That made sense at the time. But by the time we get to the New Testament, Satan has become a powerful, evil deity who is a cosmic opponent against God, very similar to Zoroastrian belief. Zoroastrians also believed in reward and punishment in the afterlife, which was an idea that was absent from Judaism until this influence. Jews believed that once you died, you went to Sheol, which was a shadowy place under the ground that didn't involve pleasure or pain. Both good and bad people went to Sheol when they died. But the Persians had ideas about reward and punishment in the afterlife, and these beliefs led to certain sects of apocalyptic Jews believing the same things. These sects of Jews were the precursor to the early Christians who were themselves Jews. Lastly, Zoroastrianism contains the idea of a Saoshyant, a savior who will come at the end of time to defeat evil and raise the dead. In Judaism, messianic expectations became more pronounced during the Persian and Hellenistic periods, particularly in apocalyptic literature like the Book of Daniel, which includes end times visions, a final battle between good and evil, and resurrection. Zoroastrianism is actually one of the first religions to believe in a general resurrection, prior to both Judaism and, of course, Christianity. This is one of many examples of how Judaism was influenced by other cultures. Once you see how these religious ideas developed, they become so much easier to explain. The contradictions and changes over time actually begin to make sense. The next issue that really changed my perspective was free will. I had always just assumed that free will existed because everyone who I heard speak about it, mainly pastors, just spoke about it as if it was something that must exist necessarily for the Christian worldview to make sense. I actually agree with this because if we don't have free choice, then we can't be punished for not choosing God. But I eventually realized after studying the issue that free will is a logically incoherent idea. Our decisions can only be explained by our influences or our inherent natures, both of which are entirely outside of our control. No one can choose the thoughts that arise in their mind. You can actually test this. Think of a type of animal, any animal in the world. Just pick a random animal and hold that animal in your mind. Now, first think about all the animals that you have never heard of that were therefore unavailable for you to pick. These animals would have been a possible choice for others who did know about them, but they weren't to you because for whatever reason you just didn't know them. The fact that you have never been exposed to certain animals is outside of your control. Now think about all the animals that you do know that just never occurred to you. You have surely heard of iguanas, but perhaps that option just didn't pop into your mind. You have no control over that either. So all that's left are the animals that you know and that happen to pop into your mind. Why did those animals pop into your mind? Did you choose to think of them before you thought of them? Or did they just appear in consciousness seemingly out of nowhere? Well, if you're like me, they just appeared and you picked one. Why did you pick the animal that you decided to pick? Maybe you have an explanation like, I think it's cute, or I was just learning about this animal the other day. But those things are also outside of your control. You can't choose to think something is cute that you just don't. And you can't choose which inputs from your personal experience get called up to the forefront of your mind. You are not in control of your thoughts. They simply spring into consciousness from the void as the result of determined factors. True free will would require an ability to pick the thoughts you want to think before you think them, which would create an infinite regress as to why you picked that thought over another one. It was uncomfortable to accept that I don't have free will, but when I understood that the entire idea doesn't make any sense, it was easier to move on. What I tell myself is that the truth has a way of making itself manifest in the world, and so those influences, the ones based on truth, will have a tendency to be the ones that affect my beliefs and actions. I want to take a moment to focus on another aspect of my deconstruction journey, which is God's goodness. Perhaps the most classic objection of all time to God is that because of all the evil and suffering in the world, he either isn't good or isn't all-powerful. When I was a Christian, this objection was easily explained away by free will. God gave us free will and we choose to do bad things, and that's why there's so much suffering. For the moment, we can ignore the fact that this doesn't explain stuff like natural disasters and diseases. But the reason I don't think that free will is an excuse for all the suffering in the world actually has nothing to do with the fact that I don't believe that free will exists. The true problem is that in order to refer to God as good, it must mean something. Let me explain. Imagine you walk into a room and see a young child being mercilessly beaten by an adult. And let's say you know that the adult is doing this sheerly out of hatred and a desire to cause suffering. And let's also say that it would be easily within your power to stop the attacker. So do you have all that in your mind? You stumble across a child being beaten by an evil person that you could easily stop with your own strength. If you're a Christian, do you have a moral obligation to stop this from happening? In other words, would it be a sin for a Christian to just turn around and walk away from the suffering child and pretend like nothing was wrong? I think the vast majority of Christians would say, yes, it's wrong to allow a child to be tortured when you could easily stop it, all else being equal. So if it's wrong for people to allow suffering of this kind, how do we explain the fact that God is allowing suffering just like this and far worse, thousands of times a day? God is turning around and walking away every time. Why is it not just as wrong for God not to intervene as it is for people not to intervene? If morality is truly objective and God is a moral agent, then any moral duty that applies to us must also apply to God. Otherwise, he is abiding by a completely different moral standard, and it becomes meaningless to refer to him as good. Because if he is not good like we understand goodness, then we have no reason to call him good if that word means anything like we think it does. Free will doesn't change the equation here. If you see a child being beaten and you think it is morally good for you to use your free will to stop another person from using their free will to commit evil, then the same applies to God. You would never be in that situation and think, well, I could save this child, but I don't want to violate the free will of the perpetrator, so I guess I'll just walk away. This is how Christians seem to think God behaves. But good people don't behave that way. If you want to let God off the hook because he's God, that's fine, but you just can't call him good. Because good moral agents don't allow the abuse of children when they could stop it. Free will is not an excuse. Also, it's worth pointing out that every time an evil person takes advantage of an innocent person, they are violating the free will of that person. So if God really cared about free will, he would ensure that evil humans cannot violate the free will of other humans. These are just some of the realizations that I came to in this journey, and at one point I experienced an existential crisis where I just had no idea what to do. I went outside and looked up at the stars and wondered to myself, what is going on? Why is all of this here? I ended up coming to the conclusion that I still believe God exists, but we can't know very much about him. Read Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason, for more information on that viewpoint. But my beliefs are still evolving, and one thing's for sure, I don't make any claims as to having it all figured out. I'm still learning and growing and trying to do the best that I can. I also want to say that I don't feel any negative feelings towards Christians. The vast majority of Christians I've met are great people. I actually still believe that the Christian life, at least in America in 2025, is a really good way to live, assuming you believe that it's true. This is the kind of rationalization that kept me in the faith and also keeps pastors preaching and apologists apologizing. They tell themselves that they are doing a good thing by perpetuating belief among their followers. But this approach is not without its harms. I feel purposely misled by people I trusted. And as I said in the beginning, these were well-meaning people. But it doesn't change the fact that many of these people, apologists in particular, misrepresented the truth in order to convince me to believe in a certain worldview. It's hard not to be upset by that. After I deconstructed, I left my church small group, which was a painful decision. But I couldn't continue to rationalize pretending to believe something that I no longer did, just to maintain relationships that made me happy and were honestly good for me. It felt selfish. But the fact that I currently do feel pretty alone is why I wanted to make this video. If you're watching this and you feel alone, just know that you're not. And if you feel like there's nowhere to turn, once again, know that many people are in the same situation or have been in that situation in the past. There is hope. There is freedom in the acceptance of the unknown. Being certain about things you cannot know for sure is not the best path through life. The best path, in my opinion, is openness and humility. This is why I don't claim to have it all figured out. In fact, I've realized just how little I know, and there's freedom in that. If I'm wrong about all this and Christianity is true, I really want to know. I hope that God, if he exists, will show me that I'm wrong. I have prayed that he will.